Well, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Westad. He's a Norwegian. He got his first degree from the University of Oslo, and he did his graduate studies in the United States. After graduating, he was appointed at the faculty of the London School of Economics. Then he moved to Harvard, and now he's at Yale. He's teaching both at the Department of History, but also the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs. So he combines history with current affairs. He's a world-known expert on the Cold War, but he's also an expert on Southeast Asia and on China, and he has written extensively on this issue. He has written about 16 books. I'm losing track. And the last one, which we'll be discussing today, is the coming storm that comes with a very threatening cover that has the Latin numerical of 3, implying that we are on the verge of the Third World War. It's a theme that before him, Jimmy Diamond, the chief executive of JP Morgan, played a couple of years ago. He said, with so many flashpoints, probably the Third War has already started and we don't know it. So Arne will ask this question, whether this war has already started or it's about ready to start. And from methodological reasons, he will, I hope, will explain the value of the historical analogizing, because we have so many historical parallels are being thrown in the public debate, from the Allison Thucydides trap to whether our current situation is similar to before World War II, not before World War I. So why it's World War I, Professor?
That is the question, Athanasios. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to this group. What a wonderful assemblage of people with different backgrounds and different interests. I'm sure we'll have a really good discussion afterwards in terms of the topic of today, which is an urgent one and a somewhat distressing one, going back to what Athanasios said about the very looming numeral at the front cover of the US, and we now also established the Greek edition of this book. It's interesting, Athanasios, that you mentioned JP Morgan. I think this book has it's been quite widely reviewed, but I think the people who started discussing it first were mainly people in financial sectors rather than in politics or in academia. We'd watch actually say something about the significance of these kinds of topics in terms of where it is picked up. So I'm going to introduce the book briefly and the concerns that are in it. I think we should set up as much time as we possibly can for discussion, because with a group like this in the audience, I think that is the fun part of all of this, and not me just running through the issues. But this is a book. It's a small book. It's a brief book. You can read it in about 3 hours, we have established. Don't read it late at night unless you have some strong drink or whatever you need to calm yourself down with at hand. But do read it, because I think it is a useful part of the discussion of where we are going in international affairs. And it was driven in terms of writing it last year, mainly by sheer irritation. I was annoyed with the many very facile comparisons that you found, particularly in the United States, I guess, but also to some extent in China and elsewhere, between the situation that we are in now in terms of international affairs and the Cold War. So I spent a lot of my career working on the Cold War as an historian in various forms. And if there is one thing I'm pretty sure of, is that whatever we want to call the international system we are in now, it is not the Cold War. It doesn't have any of the Cold War bipolarity connected to it. It doesn't have the primacy of ideologies and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But it's clear to me that the explanation of what we are living through now as another Cold War is not very helpful. And then as an historian, after having been duly annoyed by that argument, I started looking around to see if there are analogies, if there are parallels, not exact parallels because those do not exist, but parallels that are good enough to provide us with some warnings about what could go wrong elsewhere in history. And that's how I started thinking about the world at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, not as an exact parallel, but as a pretty similar, in many ways, kind of era to what we are living through now. So that is the key argument in the book. It's very simple. The world today looks increasingly like the world from the 1890s to World War I. And of course, leading from that is the postulation that we have to take great care not to repeat some of the mistakes that led to war in 1914. That's the very straightforward version of what I'm talking about in this book. So I'm going to draw on the example of some of my esteemed colleagues, especially some of those I worked with at Harvard, in order to come up with a discussion of these matters. And people like Graham Allison and Ernie May, they're very, very good at doing this. Ernie always used to, when you are presented with an historical parallel or analogy or simile or call it whatever you want, to talk about similarities and differences, because that can help us discuss. And I'm going to follow the same method today. I'm going to look at similarities first between that time period more than 100 years ago and today, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as differences, because there are some significant differences, and it's some of those differences that give us hope in many ways. So what are the similarities? The similarities are many, and the most important ones, I think, are these. We are living through a time period now of rising powers confronting established powers. And that's very similar to the kind of situation that we had at the beginning of the 20th century, as Graham Allison has pointed out in his wonderful book on the Thucydides trap. Now, back then, one rising power, the United States, had its own continent, and it was an ocean away from where the main center of action at that point was in Europe, just like the main point of action, in my view now, is East Asia. So the United States was rising probably faster than any other leading power, but it was an ocean away from the center of development. The other rising power, the main rising power, Germany, was right in the middle of the most important part of the world back then in Europe. And it had grown very, very quickly from nothing in the middle part of the 19th century to becoming the leading economic power and then gradually also the leading military power in Europe. And of course, this led to conflicts and tensions. It led to the unsettling of a whole international system that had been in place for some time. Just like China's rise in East Asia has pushed in the same direction for our own time and age. China, of course, had been around as a state for much longer than what Germany has. But the China that I first encountered when I came there as an undergraduate exchange student back in the late 1970s didn't really count that much in international affairs. I mean, it was a dirt poor, terrorized country. And its GDP per capita was lower than the average of most African countries. And it was pointing downwards. So the advance of China as a leading state within what is now the most important region of the world has happened very quickly, perhaps even more quickly than Germany's growth in the late 19th century. So that's similarity number one. Similarity number two is that I think we are already now in a multipolar world, not a bipolar world like the Cold War or a unipolarity, as some people at least would claim that we had after the Cold War was over, with the United States being the main power. And within these conditions of multipolarity, many great powers rivaling each other, alliances, of course, alliances and friendships become more important than what they are in these other forms of international organization. And the problem back in the early 20th century was that Germany, the main rising power in Europe, was allied to a decrepit empire right next door, Austria or Austria-Hungary or the Habsburg monarchy or whatever you want to call it. An empire in decline that had some kind of conflict with almost all its neighbors. Quite explosive conflicts in many cases. And there are some similarities between that particular alliance and China and Russia today. China is a pseudo ally of Russia, which is also, in my view, an empire in decline, which has quarrels with a lot of its neighbors. There is a lot of worry, I think, in those kinds of comparisons. But there are others as well that we can talk about in terms of multipolar conditions. Thirdly, you have an intensification of competition within the same economic system. So very different from the Cold War, where the Soviet Union self-isolated, didn't want to be part of that globalizing system that was set up, first and foremost by the United States in the late 20th century. The expansion of capitalism, if you like. The Soviet Union didn't want more for itself within that system. It wanted to smash that system, destroy it. Today, the competition happens, broadly speaking, within the same global economic system, just like was the case in the period before 1914. And that leads to one of the similarities that I think are really important, but not that often commented upon. And that is that as that intensification of competition had been going on for some time, it is those who have set up that system, who've been the main forces in constructing it, Britain back in the 19th century and the United States today, that are starting to sense that it's not working for them the way that it was intended to work. Others were catching up in terms of trade, in terms of production, in terms of technology. And within the establishment powers in the early 20th century, you had this wide discontent with globalization, with 19th century globalization. Very much along the same lines as you see the discontent with globalization in the early 21st century. Very often first starting from the establishment powers, and of course in our own time and age, first and foremost, Donald Trump's United States of America, with the idea that others are taking advantage of the United States, stealing its jobs, stealing its technology, setting themselves up in a position that the United States really should have. Very similar to what happened with Britain and to some extent other establishment powers in the early part of the 20th century, leading in the same direction, a sudden turn towards protectionism, trade wars, tariffs, so that a economic system that had been expanding and integrating for a very long time start to contract. Another similarity, which goes along with what I've just been discussing, are very significant, very high-level technological revolutions. In the early 20th century, communications, telephone, telegraph, steamships, railways, the first aircraft, this general sense that technology was changing very, very rapidly, which made a lot of people nervous. I write about this in the book. I think in many ways, the rapid technological revolutions in the early 20th century had a bit of the same effect as our revolutions, the coming together of computing power and communications technology into what became the global internet, has had in their own day and age. Instead of connecting people more closely together, you had widespread fears and resentments of others. You had increasing preoccupation with others stealing tech secrets, of espionage that deals with some of the technological advances that have been made in one country to the advantage of another country. So that preoccupation with technology is another thing that the two eras have in common. And out of this then, politically, came this remarkable rise in populism and nationalism, anti-Semitism in the early 20th century, which was the poison that first came into the European political systems in overall terms. This preoccupation with defining what nation actually meant, the belief in strongmen, the belief in populist politics, all of which destabilized the political systems in many countries well before the war started. And then finally, in terms of these structural changes, you had the rising concern connected to what I've just been talking about with immigration and with terrorism. On the side of terrorism, obviously some of these concerns were real. The more heads of state were assassinated in the period from 1900 to 1914 than at any other point in history. And of course, it was one of these terrorist acts, a black swan event, if you ever had one, in Sarajevo in the summer of 1914, that set in motion the development that led to disaster in late July. So there are many similarities, I think, between this time period and our own, and they are very complicated when you try to think them through, but they also constitute, in my view, rather clear warnings in terms of the similarities between the two. Now, it's important to notice that the argument in the book is that what led to disaster in the summer of 1914 was a mixture of these long-term resentments and fears and short-term conflicts. More and more Germans in the period just before the war were convinced that other nations were out to do them in. Germany was restricted and contained, that version of the story goes, because it was Germany. And this was not entirely taken out of thin air. While Germans were remarkably proud, for very good reasons, just like people in China are now, about the almost unbelievable progress that their country had made within a very short period of time, others really didn't have much of a response to that kind of development. There was a very clear inability of establishment powers to agree a role for Germany within its region. Instead of complaining about German rhetoric, German behavior, and at the end of the day complaining most heavily about German successes. My Yale colleague, the great historian Paul Kennedy, in his book from almost 50 years ago on the rise of Anglo-German antagonism in the late 19th century, Paul says that, what Britain was basically telling the Germans was, little Hans, if you would only stop growing, then everything would be fair, everything would be fine, everything would work well. There wouldn't be a problem in the world. If you would just stick to running around in lederhosen and not bothering anyone else. But that's, of course, not what Germany could do or wanted to do. It had gone through this remarkable transformation, high-level transformation, just like China has gone through a remarkable transformation today. It was very proud of its achievements. It felt that it should have a bigger place within the region than what it was actually given. In my view, Britain back then would have been better served by attempting to reconcile conflict between Germany and its neighbors rather than fanning the flames of some of these conflicts. And Britain and the other establishment powers, including France and Russia, would have been much better served by trying to involve Germany in attempts at solving local tensions rather than excluding it. I think those are important lessons for our own time. So in terms of differences, I promise some differences that could give hope. What are these differences? Well, the most important difference to me, and not just speaking as an historian, but as a citizen, is that we know how it all ended. We know what kind of unmitigated disaster the First World War came to be, that it set off probably 3 generations of suffering. First, of course, the disasters of the war itself that set the world back by at least a generation. Then the disasters of the interwar period, the rise of totalitarian ideologies, a global economic crisis, the Great Depression, of on unprecedented severity, and then a Second World War, very much based on the ruins of the First World War, and then the Cold War that followed. Much of this, almost all of it, was rooted in the suffering of the Great War, as it was called back then, of the First World War. And of course, that knowledge in itself concentrates the mind in terms of being alert to how important it is to avoid similar development in our own time. And secondly, in terms of differences, we have international organizations that simply did not exist in the early part of the 20th century. The United Nations was set up explicitly, as many of you will know, to free the world from the kind of disasters that had befallen it in the early part of the century. And the United States was among the key countries, perhaps the key country when it came to its early years, to draw on the potential that was there in international organizations, and especially the UN. And it seems to me that that is not the case today, but there is still an instrument there that, if used in the way it was intended to be used, could stand between us and the kind of disasters that we have seen in the past. And then the third big difference, I think there are other differences too, but the one I want to point out here is that the United States today still has a system of worldwide alliances and friendships that no other power can match. That was not the case before the First World War. Britain was by far the most powerful country, but it didn't have that kind of international system behind it. And I think, used wisely, judiciously, that system of American friendships and alliances is something that could stand between us and disaster. Doesn't seem to me to be the direction that things are moving in at the moment, but it's there, and it's there as a possibility to be used. Let me finish by talking a little bit about China and about East Asia, not just because this is the week in which President Trump and President Xi are meeting in Beijing, but also because I think it's important to try to connect that more directly to some of the general concerns that I have in this book. And since I worked a great deal on China myself in my career, there is no doubt in my mind that the current Chinese leadership wants their country to be, to quote Xi Jinping, predominant in Eastern Asia in all respects. And that's not in itself an unreasonable aim. China has for a long time been the biggest, the most significant country in East Asia, an empire with deep roots in history. The idea that many Chinese, given the kind of remarkable development that the country has gone through, sees itself as being at the center of developments within its region is not in itself unreasonable. And I think it's important to note that. The question is, of course, how and when that happens. And this is what connects to the early part of the 20th century and to Germany's role back then. Now, Germany did, in my view, become the key power in Europe. But it happened only after two world wars and a global depression and all of the suffering of the Cold War. I think it's really important for China's own leaders that they avoid that scenario for China. So it's not that China's strategic aims, the way I see them, are by themselves unreasonable. It is how and when that happens. And if there is pressure within the system for that to happen very quickly, you can easily end up in a situation that reminds us a little bit about what happened in the early part of the 20th century. Now, of course, this goes along with the undoubted fact that the US role in the world has changed. The United States today is seen as a much more self-interested power than what was the case before. And of course, style also matters on these things, especially in Asia. I think it's hard to imagine an American president that is more difficult to translate culturally more than linguistically into an understanding of American aims in East Asia or before an Asian audience. And I think this is where the manner in which Sino-American antagonism has risen is important. Of course, this is about status powers and rising powers, but it's also, I think, now in the two peoples, at least among some of them, a rather deep sense of frustration and even betrayal. So the two countries had worked very closely together as China's rise took place, worked together, of course, politically and even militarily against the Soviet Union during the latter stages of the Cold War. And now this kind of situation where the two countries are viewing each other as enemies. And I think that's a difficult and dangerous set of perceptions. And I think given the similarities that are there with the early 20th century, and this is where the point Anastasios made about the use of historical parallels comes in. Given the similarities that I find with the pre-1914 world, it is actually quite important that we do move away from the Cold War parallel, or indeed from the parallel with the world in the interwar years, which was also a very, very different world from the one we're living in now, mainly because the world had already just gone through a global disaster that marked everyone who had been touched by it. Now it's 80 years ago since we had a great power conflict. We had many wars in the meantime, disastrous wars, but not at the great power level. So trying to understand that parallel in terms of the warnings that it gives is actually rather important. And maybe especially the way the Sino-American relationship has been evolving within an increasingly multipolar context. It happens within a much more unstable and much more unpredictable framework than what the Cold War ever was. And taking that on board, I think, particularly from policymakers' perspectives, is really important. And to me, and I've written about this recently in Foreign Affairs, Taiwan is the best example of that. So the Taiwan conflict, cross-straits conflict, to me, is a little bit like Bosnia, Alsace, and Belgium rolled into one in the pre-1914 setting. It has the similar nationalist connotations as Bosnia, which was, of course, part of what led to disaster. It has some of the same territorial implications between Germany and France back then as Alsace-Lorraine, Alsace-Lorraine did. And it has some of the same strategic implications as Belgium. The only real existing German strategic plan, battle plan before World War I, the Schlieffen Plan, had as one of its basic precepts that Germany would be able to move through neutral Belgium, encircle Paris, and basically beat France within a week or 10 days at most. Not taking into consideration that Belgium was the only country in Europe with which Britain had a functional treaty, thereby almost ensuring that Britain would be brought into the war. So the immediate gratification in battlefield terms was deemed more important than the risk that was taken in constituting a compact against Germany that would, in the longer run, be really dangerous for Germany's survival during the war. Very much the same is the case with regard to Taiwan today. Taiwan is the only immediate conflict, at least over which the great powers have some degree of control, that I think could lead to an almost immediate war between China and the United States. And that worries me intensely. So I think it's very important, just to finish on that point, to try to reduce tensions between the United States and China over Taiwan. And I've also written about this recently. So let me conclude then with a summary of what I think is needed coming out of this setting that I've now drawn up for you. I think linking it to the summit that's now going on in Beijing, and it's great that the leaders of the most powerful countries in the world are talking to each other, for sure. But it's also very important to try to do so within a setting where each side develops a better understanding of the other's strategic situation. And I think that is what is missing with the ongoing conversations in Beijing, what we know about them, and what has been the case between the great powers over the last decade and a half. The parallel with what happened in the early 20th century is very clear. There was a lot of talking going on. These people knew each other, the leaders knew each other intimately. Some of them were closely related. The German Kaiser, the Russian Tsar, the British King were cousins. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was the oldest and favorite grandson of Queen Victoria. She literally died in his arms. But that didn't prevent these two countries from going to war with each other only a few years later. So I think talking is one thing, better understanding the kind of strategic aims that others have within a very complex multipolar setting is something else that we need to strive towards if we want to have any chance, I think, of preserving world peace in the longer run. I also think we need to enhance trade and communications rather than trying to restrict them. Of course, there are particular tools within trade, tech tools today, that for strategic reasons should be restricted, but they are few and far between. And I think it's important to open up for more of this kind of interaction, not because it in and by itself creates peace and stability, but because it creates more contact. And that contact in itself, certainly in the somewhat longer run, has more of an opportunity to create a more stable system. I think we need to contain regional flashpoints rather than exacerbating them. I think we need to move towards ceasefires in Iran. We need to move towards a ceasefire in Ukraine. Not because these conflicts by themselves would lead to another great power war, but because if a real world-class crisis that we cannot foresee at the moment were to come along, I fear that these conflicts could have the same kind of role as you saw with some of the regional conflicts prior to 1914, that they just would come together in stimulating that global conflagration when there were events happening that no one felt that they could really control. I think for China, the main issue today is not so much relations with the United States. I don't think the summit is going to lead to any breakthrough. I hope it will lead to more stability, but I don't think it will lead to any significant breakthrough. What China needs to do is to repair its regional relations, which are very bad at the moment, with Japan, with South Korea, with Southeast Asia, with India. It will be very hard for China to become a predominant hegemon within that region without having somewhat better relations with the countries that surround it. And then for the United States, as I argue in the book, I see no problem in seeking to balance the rise of Chinese power, working with friends and allies in so doing, but not in ways that are intended to preclude China's growing interaction with other countries, regionally or globally. I think that's one of the lessons of the relationship among the establishment powers with Germany prior to the First World War, that there are limits to how much you should try to balance in the direction of containment. I think that would be a tragedy in terms of the situation that we now have with regard to China. So the recipe in terms of this particular relationship, looking at East Asia, to me is a little bit like what Britain did not do in 1914, which is a combination of deterrence and reassurance to avoid war. And I think it's very hard to find that balance in terms of strategy, in terms of the Sino-American relationship. And we certainly do not seem to be on the way towards it at the moment. But hopefully, that's the direction that American policy would be developing in working with friends and allies in the Eastern Asian region. I think any sign that the United States would be withdrawing quickly from the positions that it currently has in backing up others in East Asia could lead to absolute disaster. And I think that's the timing element that I have in the book. It's not that you should try to prevent change, but it's how and when that change happens that would be of critical importance in terms of how the world develops. So Nathaniel, that was what I had to say today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions.